malgré que je roule dans toutes les boîtes de nuit, cherchant l'ivresse pour que ma tristesse sombre à jamais dans le bruit. Je hais ce plaisir qui muse, et quand on croit que je m'amuse, j'ai des pleurs plein mon cœur. C'est le cafard, je le sens qui me perce comme avec un poignard la cervelle par en part. Je me sépare dans le brouillard, j'ai beau faire, je suis prise et bien prise au traquenard du cauchemar. C'est le cafard.
The League Against Imperialism was an international organization founded in 1927 at a congress in Brussels, where 174 delegates representing 31 states, colonies or regions, and 134 organizations came together to support the liberation of colonies and to build solidarities between workers in imperialist countries and the oppressed in the colonies.
The League Against Imperialism was the organization that resulted out of an extraordinary conference that met at the Palais des Monts in Brussels in February 1927. The conference was organized by the German communist Willy Munzenberg, and it gathered together 174 delegates from 31 states and colonies in an enormous show of anti-imperial solidarity.
Between 1927 and 1937, League members established local secretariats, organized campaigns, and built relationships across the colonized and colonizing world.
And for a brief time, between 1927 and 1937, the League Against Imperialism was the largest, most organized, and most diverse groups to coordinate a campaign against imperialism, a campaign to eradicate colonial rule across the world.
The League was one of the largest, most inclusive international groups of its kind. We believe the League should be studied in its own right for its successes in bringing together leftists and anti-colonial activists from so many parts of the world, and for its initial ambitions to cross racial, cultural, and ideological boundaries to achieve its larger goals.
We ended up with 15 chapters that focus on a whole variety of places. We have Latin America, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Levant, China, Europe, India, and Indonesia. Our chapters deal with a wide variety of well-known and also lesser-known activists, and they explore internationalism, international communism, Black internationalism, and Afro-Asian solidarities. Once we had invited authors to submit essays, we workshopped them in an intensive gathering in Boston. We were so fortunate to have 4 absolutely stellar discussants read the essays and provide helpful critiques during the workshop. We had Antoinette Burton from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, who also wrote the afterword to the volume. We had Erez Manila from Harvard University, who also wrote the foreword to the volume. We had Susan Pennybacker from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we had Ani Mukherjee at Hobart and William Smith College. Because of them, and also because of our terrific authors, the final essays that emerged were not only even stronger, but they also spoke to one another.
So our volume is the first global history of the League Against Imperialism. It contextualizes the movement within a rich and complex history of internationalism during the interwar years. It traces ideas, practices, and individuals as each came to shape and be shaped by the League Against Imperialism. Our chapters taken together compare and contrast, draw metaphors and analogies, and interpret collectively the global nature of anti-imperialism in the interwar and even early post-war years. We seek to underscore the intersections and overlap of perspectives from the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Europe, and to unpack the diversity of the global experience of anti-imperialism, activism, and solidarity.
In 1957, Indian Prime Minister Nehru visited the Netherlands. He was greeted at the tarmac by Dutch Prime Minister Joseph Luns, who proceeded to tell the attending press that this was the Indian Prime Minister's first ever visit to the Netherlands. And it is here, during a televised meeting, that we see Nehru break protocol and laugh. And he replies, It is not true that this is my first visit to this country. Forgive me if I contradict you. Now, that earlier visit to the Netherlands was in the wake of the Brussels Congress at which the League Against Imperialism was founded. The presence of prominent Dutch leftists had drawn several League participants to Amsterdam after the conference was over. It was duly recorded by Dutch intelligence services, leaving an inconvenient record to good bilateral relations a few decades later. It is in episodes like these that we see the lasting impact of the League. Here is evidence that the start of post-independence bilateral diplomatic relations was by no means the fresh start that some European leaders would have liked it to be. This is another reason why it's important to study the League in its full global context. Experiences at the League continued to reverberate long after the organization's demise.
In spite of its many high-profile participants and the global reach of its membership, the League remains relatively obscure and poorly understood in historical scholarship. As historians, we realize that in order to write a history of the League, we need to contend with linguistic diversity and archival dispersion across the geographical landscape. This history could not be written by a single historian, but only by bringing together researchers specializing in different aspects of the anti-imperialist movement. By doing so, we created a space for a global and transnational framework that moves beyond the categories of colony, nation, and empire to comprehend more fully the transnational nature of the 20th century world.
In my chapter, I look at the League's relationship with Latin America to see if there was something like a third world idea even before that term really came into being in the 1950s. And the short answer is yes, there was, but it was tenuous and it was ephemeral and it was quickly undone by the very force that was mainly responsible for its emergence, which was communism.
Hey there, my name is Donald Hassett, and my chapter in this book explores how the Algerian nationalist movement interacted with the League Against Imperialism. It shows that while the pioneers of Algerian nationalism may have embraced the message of global anti-colonial revolution, they were as committed to defending their organisational independence as they were to winning the freedom of their homeland. This meant that their relationship with the League was never one of subservience nor of open hostility, but rather was always dictated by their sometimes complementary, sometimes competing political interests.
In my chapter, I highlight the tradition of Arab anti-imperialism prior to and within the interwar period, and I reveal the centrality of the Great Syrian Revolt to the establishment of the League in 1927. I argue that the League provided a space for Arab activists to raise their issues on a global stage, primarily the Palestine question, but that one of the pitfalls of the League was the inability to see these issues outside of residual Orientalism and intra-European conflicts.
Manda Bilagurova. My chapter outlines how the League Against Imperialism and regional anti-imperialist leagues in the Americas, South China and Southeast Asia related to the Chinese national project through Asianist vision of Chinese intellectuals, from students to government officials. I illustrate this with the story of Liao Huanxing, who was the representative of the Comintern and Chinese Nationalist Party Kuomintang to the League in Brussels.
Hi, my name is Frederick Peterson and I have contributed with a chapter in this important and really relevant volume on the League Against Imperialism. My contribution is on the German communist Willy Münzenberg, who was the initial founder and organizer behind the League Against Imperialism, and in my chapter I have tried to summarize his activities and connections to the League Against Imperialism. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel Brookenhouse, and my chapter demonstrates how the British government used passport restrictions to reduce the ability of the League Against Imperialism to forge global networks. However, I also show how the members of the League were able to limit the scope of those government efforts. They did so by activating widespread resistance among many Britons to restricting people's freedom of movement.
My chapter focuses on the Senegalese anti-colonial militant Lamine Senghor. Firstly, I use Senghor's acclaimed speech to the Brussels Congress to explore the intersection of race, class, and anti-colonialism. Secondly, I explore the political mythology promoted by the League after Senghor's early death. So, go and read my chapter to discover the lie that Willy Munzenberg told about how Lamin Senghor died.
In my chapter, I'm asking questions about the intellectual object that sits at the heart of the League's work. By examining how participants in the League's initial conferences described the kinds of politics they were participating in terms of material conditions they opposed and the futures they desired, I arrive in my chapter at the ways in which anti-imperialism was thought, via the forms of difference nested inside a universal project.
So the anti-imperialist echo in India is about the ways in which the League Against Imperialism found expression and came to be embedded into the main ideas of the Indian National Congress, and primarily through the Indian National Congress's Foreign Department, which is a rich archive that very few historians have really examined. So I argue that the League Against Imperialism, in terms of its ideas, practices, and networks, came to shape the Indian National Congress movement through the Indian National Congress Foreign Department. I also talk a bit about how the Indian National Congress and its own trajectory came to shape the history and the ideas of the League Against Imperialism. So that this is not simply the ways in which the League shaped India, but also the ways in which India shaped the League Against Imperialism.
My chapter looks at the wide-ranging network assembled by V.K. Krishna Menon in London in the 1920s and 1930s after the Brussels Conference, which really continued the spirit of the LAI as a united front against colonialism. And I show how that was intertwined with Nehru continuing his involvement with the LAI through the 20s and 30s.
My name is Christopher Lee, and I'm an associate professor of history and Africana studies at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. My chapter is entitled The Leninist Movement in South Africa, and it uses a biographical lens to understand the effects of the League Against Imperialism on South African politics, specifically through the lives of James and Alex Laguma.
My name is Caroline Stolte, and my chapter traces the regionalist rhetoric that emerged at the League Against Imperialism and traces it through time past independence and into the 1950s. Specifically, I look at 3 Indian women whose political formation occurred in close proximity to the League, but who made this type of regionalism their own and adapted it to the post-war context, who continue to advocate in new international forums for decolonization.
I'm Jeffrey Byrne. My chapter looks at some of the longer-term consequences and legacies of the League Against Imperialism. I argue that the League was a major event in the evolution of international society across the 20th century on a global scale. So my chapter actually focuses on the 1950s and the 1960s, quite a bit after the League Against Imperialism, and I look at efforts to create international institutions that would consolidate decolonization and give expression to anti-colonial solidarity.